With just 10 days of voting left, both the Biden and Trump campaigns are looking at Pennsylvania's 20 electoral votes. Like many states, Pennsylvania has a relatively new vote-by-mail law that's supposed to help voters. But it may, in fact, be doing more harm than good in certain cases, according to a report by ProPublica and the Philadelphia Inquirer. They found that the vote-by-mail law passed late last year may actually be hurting low-income voters, especially in Philadelphia. The reason, according to the report, lawmakers didn't take into account the hardships faced by people living below the poverty line, things like language barriers, lack of internet access, and unstable housing. Joining us now is one of the co-authors of that article, Jonathan Lai from the Philadelphia Inquirer. Jonathan, thank you for joining us. So first, let's start off with just a little bit of background about the law, why it was passed, who it has helped, and has it in fact hurt low-income voters, or has it just not helped them in the same way as other voters?
You know, a year ago, Pennsylvania didn't even allow most voters to vote by mail. We had a really restrictive absentee system, and very few people were ever even eligible to vote by mail. That changed, and so this year, any Pennsylvania voter can vote by mail without any sort of reason. That's obviously been a huge deal given the pandemic and the number of people who want to vote by mail rather than show up in person. So in fact, in our primary, about half of the votes were cast by mail. But here's the thing. Just like every other law, just like every time policy is being made, there are always people who are being left out. And what we found is poor and low-income people, particularly poor and low-income Philadelphians, were just not being centered in the policymaking. And so what you end up seeing is if you're facing some of those barriers that you described, if you don't have a computer, if you don't read English, if you don't have a stable address, voting by mail is just not a convenient option for you, even though on paper you're allowed to do it. And so what ends up happening is middle class and wealthier voters are more able to use vote by mail, and they are using it. And so, in fact, the people who are benefiting the most are the kinds of voters who already had access to vote and already had higher turnout.
But is it actually disadvantageous to them, or is it just not as easily accessible? I mean, low-income voters still have the traditional avenues available to vote, right?
That's right. This is where it gets a little bit tricky. Look, on paper, everyone benefits from having this option. It is obviously true that it is more flexible and more convenient and more accessible to have the option of voting by mail. The law doesn't say you have to vote by mail. You can still vote in person. So the reality is no, there's not voter suppression here. Nobody's being disenfranchised. But the thing is this, we have to think about it this way. If you're a poor or low-income Philadelphian and voting by mail doesn't really help you, nothing has changed for you in terms of going to vote in person on election day. But if you're wealthier, if you're more able to vote by mail, now you have more options. So the disparity isn't really that one group is being suppressed, it's that another group is getting more access in potentially an unfair way if poor and low-income Philadelphians still face these concrete barriers to being able to vote by mail.
Interesting. Okay. Your article also mentions low voter turnout in low-income neighborhoods isn't actually a race issue. Care to explain that?
That's right. Well, it's the United States of America. I mean, race and class are deeply intertwined. It's not like they're two separate things. But, you know, we do have to be really careful. I mean, in a city like Philadelphia, which is majority minority, there are poor Black people, yes, but there are also wealthy Black people. There are also middle-class Black people, for example. And so what we found in Philadelphia is that if you're in a wealthier majority-minority neighborhood, you are actually still seeing higher turnout and you are seeing higher use of vote by mail.
Well, 1 in 4 Philadelphia residents lives below the poverty line. That's actually the highest percentage of any major U.S. city. And it also obviously happens to be in this very important battleground state. How important is all of this when it comes to the outcome of this election?
It's huge, right? Every election, there are always going to be people who don't vote, whether they choose not to or they're unable to. And the reality is, in a city like Philadelphia, which is the biggest city in Pennsylvania, as you mentioned, a major battleground state, there are a lot of votes being left on the table. And they're being left on the table because people are being left out of the system they're unable to vote, or they don't trust the system. And this new option of voting by mail isn't necessarily helping them. So yes, there are poor and low-income Philadelphians who could vote, who could swing an election, but their voices aren't being heard right now.
Jonathan, this is so interesting because you do want to make it as easy as possible for people to vote. You want to try and increase access to voting. But as you point out, if it just widens the disparities between rich and poor, then it does create another set of problems. So I guess I'm wondering what the solution is to this. What can lawmakers actually do to create better access for low-income voters while also trying to protect other voters, particularly in this pandemic?
That's right. I mean, to be fair, these are deep structural problems embedded within our society. I mean, if we wanted to talk about all of the barriers that poor and low-income Philadelphians face, we're not just talking about solving some voting issues. We're talking about solving the affordable housing crisis. We're talking about solving poverty.
Right.
We're talking about solving the literacy crisis, right? So there are deep problems that exist. However, we do know that there are some policies that can particularly help poor and low-income voters or non-voters. Two in particular that stand out, according to the political scientists that I talked to. One is what we call automatic voter registration. So that's like when you go to the DMV or you interact with state government in some other way, you automatically get signed up to vote. I think a lot of us are familiar with the motor voter rules, where you go to get your driver's license and they ask you whether you want to check a box and sign up to vote. What automatic voter registration does is they assume you want to sign up to vote, and you can check a box to say you don't want to. But what that does is that reduces the barrier of registration. The other major policy reform that could occur and could help poor and low-income voters in particular is what we call same-day voter registration or election day registration. So on election day, you would be able to go to the polls and register to vote if you're not registered, or update your address if it's not up to date, and then vote in person. The major reasons that those help: you don't have these earlier barriers of registration. You don't have to have thought about the election before election day. You can just automatically be registered to vote or show up and vote.
Very interesting things here. All right, Jonathan Lai, thank you.
Thank you.